Have you ever been told without words that you don't belong? Imagine boarding a plane, ticket in hand, only to find someone sitting in your seat. Now imagine that person looks you in the eye and says you must be mistaken, because in their mind, someone who looks like you couldn't possibly belong in first class. This isn't just about a seat. It's about dignity, about being forced into a choice: stay quiet to keep the peace, or stand tall to claim what is rightfully yours. If you were in that moment surrounded by silence, with eyes judging, recording, doubting, what would you do? Would you move on and let the world reaffirm its bias? Or would you take a stand and risk everything to reveal the truth? One man's decision on Flight 382 shocked not just his fellow passengers, but the entire aviation industry. His calm refusal to move turned into a movement that changed lives far beyond the walls of that airplane. This is more than a story. It's a question for all of us. And it starts right here. If this resonates with you, please like, share, and subscribe so more voices can be heard and more stories like this can spark change. The terminal at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport buzzed with its usual mix of voices, rolling suitcases, and last-minute gate changes. It was early afternoon, and most travelers wore the same expression, half weary, half impatient. Among them was David Carter, a tall black man in his early 40s, moving quietly through the boarding line for Skyway's Airlines Flight 382 to San Francisco. Unlike most first-class passengers, he wasn't dressed in a tailored suit or polished shoes. Instead, he wore a black hoodie, dark jeans, and clean sneakers. His only accessory was a simple leather backpack slung over one shoulder. To anyone passing by, he looked like just another traveler. That was exactly what David wanted. He had spent too many years in boardrooms, wearing ties that felt more like armor than clothing. When he flew, he preferred comfort. As David stepped into the narrow aisle of the aircraft, the muted glow of the first-class cabin greeted him. The leather seats, the subtle scent of new upholstery, the hush of wealth. He had sat in this section many times before. He glanced at the boarding pass in his hand. Seat 2A, window. But when he reached row 2, his steps slowed. The seat was already taken. A woman sat there, leaning comfortably against the headrest, scrolling through her phone. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled. Her jewelry gleamed even in the low cabin light, and her travel outfit looked as though it had been selected from a luxury catalog. A designer handbag rested on the floor beneath her feet. David cleared his throat gently. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and calm. "Excuse me, ma'am. I believe that's my seat." The woman didn't look up. She lifted one manicured finger, almost as if shooing him away, while her other hand continued to scroll. "I'm quite settled here. Thank you," she said. Her tone was clipped, dismissive, the kind of voice used by someone who had never been told no. "I'm sure you can find another seat." A ripple of silence passed through the cabin. Passengers in nearby rows shifted in their seats, pretending not to watch while their eyes remained fixed on the scene. David stayed still for a moment. Then, slowly, he held out his boarding pass so she could see. "This is 2A. It's assigned to me." Only then did the woman glance up, her eyes icy blue, sharp swept over his hoodie, his jeans, his sneakers. She raised one eyebrow, the corner of her mouth curving into something between disbelief and contempt. "You must be mistaken," she replied. "This is first class. I requested this seat specifically. I'm a Platinum Elite member." Her gaze lingered on him a moment longer before she added, "You probably don't understand how first class works. The words hung in the air like smoke. David's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. A man in row 3 glanced up from his laptop, watching closely. In row 4, an older black couple exchanged a look that said they had seen this before. Near the window in row 5, a young traveler adjusted the camera equipment on his lap, his phone glowing faintly as though already recording. The woman in 2A, her name, as David would later learn, was Victoria Miller, shifted slightly in her seat, still scrolling on her phone with deliberate nonchalance. She gave off the air of someone unbothered, confident that the situation would end in her favor. For a brief second, David considered letting it go. Taking another seat would mean avoiding the stares, the whispers, the heavy weight pressing against his chest. But then he thought of the countless times in his life when he had been asked to step aside, to be flexible, simply because others assumed he didn't belong. No, not this time. He leaned forward slightly, his tone still calm, but firmer now. "Ma'am, this is my assigned seat. I would appreciate it if you would check your boarding pass and move to your correct one." A hush fell again over the cabin. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned in, sensing that something was about to unfold. Victoria finally set her phone aside. She crossed her legs, tilted her head, and let out a laugh sharp, dismissive. "Oh, my dear," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "Do you really think mistakes like this happen in first class?" She gestured around the cabin with a sweep of her hand, as though to prove her point. "When was the last time you even flew first class?" David said nothing, not yet. But in that silence, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Because what Victoria Miller didn't know, what none of the watching passengers knew, was that the man she had just dismissed, the man she assumed didn't belong in 2A, was not just another traveler. He was the CEO of AeroTech Systems, the company that powered more than half of the airline industry, and his response, calm though it might begin, was about to shake not only this flight, but the entire aviation world. For a few seconds after Victoria Miller's dismissive laugh, the cabin remained eerily quiet. The hum of the engines was still muted in the background, but all human noise had been sucked away, replaced with a charged silence. Everyone in first class pretended to stay busy, flipping magazine pages or scrolling their phones, but their eyes betrayed them. Every passenger was watching. David Carter stood tall, his boarding pass still between his fingers. His calm demeanor masked the churn of emotions beneath. Frustration, yes, but also a familiar heaviness. He had lived through enough of these encounters to know how quickly they could spiral. The questions hung in the air. Would the flight attendants intervene? Would the woman give up the seat? Or would David once again be asked to compromise? Victoria leaned back in her seat, satisfied with herself. She smoothed her designer blazer and spoke again, her tone sharper this time. "Look, I don't know what you're trying to pull, but this is my spot. I specifically told the airline I needed a window. I have a connection in Los Angeles, and I can't waste time arguing with strangers who clearly don't understand priority boarding." Her voice carried far enough that row 4 could hear every word. The older black couple sitting there exchanged another glance. The wife whispered softly, just loud enough for her husband. "Not again. Always the same thing." David caught the words. They cut deeper than Victoria's smug dismissal. He knew exactly what she meant. This wasn't just about a seat. It was about the same pattern repeating, generation after generation. In row 3, a woman with sleek dark hair and a leather briefcase quietly observed, "Sophia Ramirez, A civil rights attorney traveling to San Francisco for a conference tapped her pen against a notepad she had pulled from her bag. She was no stranger to discrimination cases. She had heard the coded language, the subtle shifts in tone. The way you don't belong was often dressed up in polite phrases. Her instincts told her this was more than a seating mix-up. She began jotting down notes. From behind them, in row 5, a young man fiddled with a tripod attached to his backpack. His name was Alex Brooks, a social media streamer known for covering travel hacks and lifestyle stories. Today, he had stumbled onto something far bigger. His phone glowed with the faint red circle of a live broadcast. Thousands of viewers were already tuned in, sending comments that scrolled rapidly across his screen. David didn't notice Alex yet. His attention was fixed on Victoria, who still hadn't reached for her boarding pass. "Ma'am," he said evenly, though his voice carried a steel edge now, "all I'm asking is for you to check your ticket. That will clear this up." Victoria scoffed. "I don't need to prove anything to you. I've flown this route for years. Everyone knows me. I'm a loyal customer. Not some." She paused, her eyes flicking once more over his hoodie and sneakers. Somebody passing through. The subtext was unmistakable, and it landed hard. A man in row 6 shook his head, muttering under his breath. The woman across the aisle from David pulled out her phone, typing furiously into her notes app. The air inside the cabin thickened with unease. David's grip on the boarding pass tightened. He thought of his assistant waiting for him in San Francisco, the back-to-back meetings stacked on his schedule, the calls that couldn't be missed. He thought of his employees, thousands of them, whose livelihoods depended on the decisions he made. And yet, in this moment, none of that mattered. To Victoria, he wasn't a CEO. He was just a black man standing in front of her seat. He inhaled slowly, trying to steady himself. The last thing he wanted was to cause a scene. But the scene had already been created, not by him, but by the woman who had decided his presence in two-way was impossible. Behind him, Sofia Ramirez cleared her throat. "Excuse me," she said politely, addressing both of them. "I couldn't help but overhear. Sir, may I see your boarding pass?" David handed it to her without hesitation. She examined it, then nodded. "Seat 2A. Confirmed." She looked directly at Victoria. "Ma'am, do you have yours?" Victoria's cheeks flushed slightly, though her confidence didn't falter. "It's in my bag somewhere, but I shouldn't have to show it. This is my seat. I always sit here." Sophia's lips tightened. She wrote something down in her notepad. At that moment, a murmur rippled through the cabin. The older man in row 4 leaned forward. "We had the same thing happen last year. Atlanta to Chicago. Same exact story. We were asked to move so a white couple could keep their seats." His wife nodded grimly. Alex Brooks tilted his phone, whispering into his mic. "Folks, you're hearing this. Multiple passengers confirming this isn't the first time. This is what systemic discrimination looks like. Live and unfiltered." His viewer count ticked upward. Comments poured in. "Unbelievable. Stand your ground. This is wrong." David still hadn't raised his voice. He didn't need to. His presence alone filled the narrow aisle, his calmness speaking louder than outrage. He turned his gaze back to Victoria. "Mrs. Miller," he said, having caught her name on a luggage tag resting by her feet. "I'm asking you one last time. Please check your boarding pass and move to your assigned seat." Her eyes narrowed. She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice but making sure it carried. "I know what you're trying to do. You think if you make a scene, the airline will hand you an upgrade, maybe even free miles. But it won't work on me. I won't be intimidated. The accusation hit David like a slap. That assumption that a black man in first class must be scamming, must be working an angle, was as old as it was insulting. It was the same suspicion he had faced at Harvard, in negotiations, even at charity galas where his donations outmatched everyone else's. It never seemed to end. Passengers shifted again. The discomfort was now palpable. Some tapped their screens harder. Some sighed loudly. But no one dared speak up against Victoria. David's mind whirred. He could let it go. He could take another seat, make his calls, land in San Francisco, and push this moment aside like so many others before it. Or he could stand firm, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. The weight of choice pressed down on him. He thought of his mother's voice. Still so clear after all these years. Dignity isn't something you beg for. Son, it's something you stand for. He closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with renewed clarity. No, not this time. David stepped closer, his tall frame casting a shadow over the disputed seat. The murmurs hushed again. All eyes were on him. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Mrs. Miller, he said, his words measured and precise. I paid for this seat. It has my name on it, and I am not moving. Victoria's laugh faltered. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in her expression, but the defiance remained. She turned, searching for support, and spotted a flight attendant preparing drinks at the galley. "Excuse me," she called, her voice ringing with indignation. "Can we get some help here? There's been a mistake." The young attendant froze, caught between training and tension. She set down the tray and began to walk toward them. The moment stretched, long and heavy, as the entire cabin braced for what would come next. The flight attendant had not yet reached them, but David Carter already felt the shift in the air. The glances, the whispers, the phones tilted just slightly upward to catch what might turn into a viral confrontation. He had lived through enough of these moments to know how they looked from the outside. A black man standing in the aisle, a white woman sitting comfortably, the unspoken assumption that the man was the problem. He stayed still, but inside, a storm brewed. David's mind pulled him back, as it often did in times like this, back to the boardrooms of New York, where he had been introduced not as the founder of AeroTech Systems, but mistaken for an assistant. Back to the cocktail parties where donors asked him what department he worked in, even after seeing his name on the cover of Fortune. Back to Harvard Business School, where a visiting executive once glanced over him and asked, "Are you here on a diversity scholarship?" He remembered the sting of those moments, but more than that, he remembered the faces of the people who stayed silent, those who looked away, those who decided it was easier to let the comment hang in the air than to challenge it. That was the silence he hated most. Now, standing in the aisle of Flight 380 knew he could hear the same silence pressing in. Passengers who knew what was happening but didn't want to get involved. Some typed furiously on their phones, perhaps outraged, but not one voice yet had spoken with the same weight as the words being thrown at him. He wondered how many of them were thinking, "Why doesn't he just take another seat?" The thought almost made him laugh, though there was nothing funny about it, because that was the choice, wasn't it? To make peace by surrendering, to be the one who gave in, who swallowed the insult so the rest of the world could keep flying without disruption. He had done it before. So had his father and his grandfather. Generations of Carter men had learned to smile through clenched teeth, but his mother had told him something different. He could see her face now as clearly as if she were sitting in the cabin with him. a petite woman with a soft voice that carried the strength of stone. "David," she used to say, "you will walk into rooms where people don't expect you. Some will stare, some will doubt, some will hate. Don't spend your life proving them wrong. Spend it proving yourself right. Dignity isn't something you beg for. It's something you stand for." Those words steadied him now. David shifted slightly, his 6'2" frame casting a long shadow across Victoria Miller's seat. He noticed the flicker of discomfort in her eyes, though she masked it quickly with another smirk. "Sir." A voice broke through his thoughts. It was the flight attendant, Emily Parker, now standing between them. She was young, maybe late 20s, her uniform crisp, her smile carefully practiced. "Can I help resolve this?" David handed her his boarding pass without hesitation. She studied it, then glanced at the seat number above Victoria's head. Her eyes narrowed for just a fraction of a second, confirming the truth. But when she looked back at David, her smile returned. Thinner this time. "It does look like you're assigned to 2A. Mr. Carter," she said gently. Then she turned toward Victoria, whose arms were crossed like a fortress. "Mrs. Miller, do you have your boarding pass?" Victoria waved dismissively. "It's in my purse somewhere, but I told you already I requested this seat. I'm a Platinum Elite member. Surely you can accommodate him elsewhere." The phrasing wasn't lost on David. Accommodate him. Always him. Never the one in the wrong. Emily hesitated. David saw it in her eyes. She knew the right thing, but she also knew the easier thing. And in her training, the easier thing often won. "Mr. Carter," she began, "we do have other excellent seats available in first class. Row 3 so, for example. Extra leg room. Very comfortable. I'd be happy to make sure you receive complimentary service for the inconvenience." The word landed like a stone in his chest. Inconvenience. He repeated it under his breath, then louder. "The inconvenience of someone else sitting in my assigned seat." Emily's smile faltered. "We're just trying to make sure everyone is comfortable, sir. Everyone, except him." David closed his eyes for a second. Behind his lids, he saw another memory. A board meeting 5 years earlier. A potential investor had ignored his entire presentation, then turned to his white colleague with a smile. "Impressive pitch," the investor said. His colleague had frozen, unsure whether to correct the man. David had smiled politely, taken a breath, and then said in a voice as calm as now, "Thank you. I'm the founder and the CEO." The investor had turned red, stumbling over apologies, but the sting lingered, because the assumption had already spoken louder than any apology. Opening his eyes again, David looked at Emily, then at Victoria, then at the cabin full of eyes pretending not to watch. This wasn't about a seat. It was about the endless demand that he be the one to bend. He shook his head slowly. "No, I'm not moving." Victoria's lips curled into a tight smile. "You see, he's making trouble. This is exactly what I meant." Sophia Ramirez's voice cut through the tension. Calm, steady, professional, with all due respect. "Mrs. Miller, Mr. Carter has a valid boarding pass. Asking him to move while you refuse to show yours, this doesn't look like customer service. It looks like discrimination." The words landed like a match on dry wood. Several passengers lifted their heads. The older couple in row 4 nodded silently. Alex Brooks tilted his phone for a better angle, whispering to his live audience, "You heard that. Folks, a civil rights attorney just used the word discrimination. This is getting serious." His viewer count jumped again. David felt a flicker of gratitude toward Sophia, but he knew what was coming. He could see it in Emily's nervous expression. She wanted out of this situation, and the only way she saw was escalation. "Perhaps I should get the captain," Emily said quickly. "Yes," Victoria said immediately, relief washing over her face. "Bring the captain. Finally, someone who understands procedures." David didn't move. He didn't sit. He didn't raise his voice. He only looked down at Victoria Miller and said softly, almost to himself, but loud enough for everyone to hear, "Procedures. Interesting word." The storm inside him had settled into something colder now, a calm clarity. He knew what was about to happen. He had seen it too many times before, but this time he wasn't going to be the one who bent. The minutes stretched uncomfortably as Emily Parker made her way toward the cockpit. The cabin felt suspended, caught between silence and anticipation. David Carter remained standing beside seat 2A, his posture calm but resolute. Victoria Miller leaned back against the headrest, her arms folded like a queen waiting for her court to defend her throne. A murmur rippled through first class. One passenger coughed into his hand. Another clicked his pen nervously. Phones tilted just slightly higher. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone. Then the cockpit door opened. Captain John Harris stepped out, tall and broad-shouldered, his crisp uniform impeccable. He had the look of a man used to being in control, used to solving problems quickly so flights could move on schedule. His eyes scanned the cabin, noting the tension, the phones, the unease. Emily gestured toward David and Victoria. "Captain, there seems to be a seating conflict." Victoria straightened immediately, her voice dripping with relief. "Yes. Thank you for coming. This gentleman is refusing to move, even though this is my seat. I specifically requested 2A, as I always do." Harris's eyes shifted to David, calm, assessing. Sir David handed over his boarding pass without a word. The captain examined it, brow furrowing slightly. "Seat 2A, he said aloud. "That's what this shows." The cabin stirred. Sophia Ramirez lifted her chin, her pen still poised over her notepad. Alex Brooks whispered to his livestream audience, "Captain just confirmed it. 2A belongs to David Carter." Comments scrolled furiously across his screen. "So why is this even a debate? This is crazy." Victoria's cheeks reddened, but her voice remained firm. "I told you, Captain, there must be a mistake in the system. I've flown Skyways for years. Everyone knows me. I shouldn't be the one inconvenienced." The captain sighed, his voice steady but heavy with the weariness of someone who had handled too many passenger disputes. "Sometimes mistakes happen, Mrs. Miller, but we need to resolve this quickly." He turned back to David, lowering his voice as though confiding in him. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but would you consider taking another seat so we can depart on time? We do have excellent alternatives available." David's eyes narrowed slightly. There it was again, the easier path, not the right one. He felt the familiar sting, the subtle implication that his comfort, his dignity, was worth less than expedience. "Captain," David said evenly, his voice calm but carrying through the cabin, "with all respect, this is my assigned seat. Asking me to move while she refuses to even show her boarding pass is not a solution. It is bias, plain and simple." A hush fell again. Harris stiffened, uncomfortable with the word bias echoing through his cabin. He glanced at Victoria, who stared back with feigned innocence, then at Emily, who looked down at her shoes, then at the passengers, their phones raised, their eyes waiting, The silence was broken by Sophia Ramirez. "Captain, I'm a civil rights attorney. I want to be very clear. What we're all witnessing right now is discriminatory treatment. Mr. Carter has complied at every step. Mrs. Miller has not, and yet he's the one being asked to compromise. That is not neutrality. That is prejudice." Gas fluttered through the rows. Victoria bristled, her composure cracking. "This is ridiculous. Don't lecture me on prejudice. I've worked hard for everything I have. I didn't get handouts. I didn't get special treatment because of some affirmative." She stopped herself, but too late. The word hung unfinished, heavy and poisonous. David felt the cabin shift. Some passengers looked down, ashamed. Others looked up, furious. Alex Brooks whispered into his mic. "You heard it. She nearly said it. This is no longer just a seating issue." His viewer count surged past 50,000. The captain raised his hand, trying to restore order. "That's enough. Let's keep this professional." David studied him carefully. Harris wanted the situation to vanish. He wanted the flight to take off on time, to keep corporate happy, to avoid bad press. But in trying to smooth over the conflict, he was exposing the deeper wound. "Professionalism," David said softly, more to himself than anyone else. He felt the words of his mother echoing again. "Dignity isn't something you beg for. It's something you stand for." He straightened his shoulders, meeting Harris's gaze squarely. "Captain, I respect your position, but I will not surrender my seat. Not this time." The older black couple in row 4 nodded quietly, their eyes glistening with a mix of pride and sorrow. They had seen this fight before, in restaurants, in workplaces, in schools. To watch someone stand firm now was both painful and powerful. Victoria scoffed loudly, as though mocking the solidarity. "This is outrageous. He's making this into a spectacle. Why should all of us be delayed because of him?" The irony stung David like a cold wind. He was the cause, she implied. Not her arrogance, not her refusal, but his insistence on dignity. Sophia's voice cut through again. "No, Mrs. Miller, this isn't a spectacle. This is accountability." The captain's jaw clenched. He glanced once more around the cabin at the raised phones, at the eyes boring into him, at the weight of the moment pressing against his authority. He took a deep breath. "We'll return to the gate until this is resolved." The announcement rippled through the cabin like a thunderclap. Gasps, murmurs, disbelief. Returning to the gate meant delays, missed connections, angry passengers. But it also meant the confrontation was no longer a private dispute. It was now an official airline incident. David exhaled slowly. He had not wanted this, but he also knew it was necessary. Victoria shook her head in outrage. "This is absurd. You're grounding the flight because of him." Harris didn't answer. He turned back toward the cockpit, his shoulders heavy. Emily followed, pale and silent. The cabin erupted in whispers. Phones buzzed. Notifications pinged. Alex Brooks's live stream count surged past 70,000 comments flooding injustice in the sky. "Hold your ground. David, this is history unfolding. Through it all." David remained standing, steady as stone. Inside, his heart pounded, but his voice when he finally spoke was calm. "This isn't about me," he said quietly, almost to himself, though Sophia heard him. "It's about the principle, the same principle too many before me had to give up." She nodded, her eyes sharp with understanding. "And maybe today, you won't have to." The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft taxied back toward the gate. The announcement of delay had already traveled through the cabin like an electric current. leaving behind an unsettled buzz. David Carter remained where he was, steady and silent, his boarding pass still clutched in one hand. Captain John Harris reappeared, his jaw tight, his expression carefully composed. He was a man who had spent decades commanding planes, crews, and passengers, yet in this moment, control felt slippery. He stopped in front of David and Victoria. His eyes rested on David first. "Sir," he said, his tone more clipped than before, "I need you to understand the position we're in. Every minute we spend on the ground costs this airline thousands of dollars. Passengers are missing connections. This situation cannot continue." David didn't flinch. "I understand perfectly, Captain, and I also understand that this situation could be resolved in less than a minute if Mrs. Miller simply produced her boarding pass." The words hung like a blade in the air. Passengers leaned closer without meaning to. Some nodded subtly. Others held their breath. Victoria let out an incredulous laugh. "You're going to put this entire flight on hold because of some misunderstanding. Really, this is ridiculous." Harris raised a hand toward her, but his gaze stayed fixed on David. "Mr. Carter, I'm asking for your cooperation, for the good of everyone on board." David's voice was calm, but underneath it ran steel. "Cooperation should not mean surrendering my rights. Captain, that's not cooperation. That's capitulation." The older black man in row 4 murmured, "That's right," his voice low but firm. His wife touched his hand gently, eyes glistening. Victoria rolled her eyes dramatically. "You see, he's turning this into some political statement. This isn't about rights. It's about courtesy." Sophia Ramirez, her notepad balanced on her lap, spoke up again. "Courtesy is asking politely. Discrimination is demanding someone of color step aside while refusing to meet the same standard yourself." Gasps and nods moved through the rows. A businessman near the aisle muttered, "She's got a point." Victoria's face tightened. She shifted in her seat, her confidence starting to show cracks. But pride was a heavy anchor, and she clung to it. "I'm not the one making a scene. I'm not the one holding up this flight." David's calm voice cut through her words. "You're right, Mrs. Miller. You're not making a scene. You're making a choice to cling to privilege instead of fairness." Her cheeks flushed crimson. She turned sharply to Captain Harris. "Are you just going to let him insult me like this? I'm a valued customer. I spend tens of thousands of dollars with this airline every year." Harris shifted uncomfortably. He wanted to resolve the situation, but every word spoken tightened the knot further. "Let's be practical," he said finally. "Mr. Carter, if you move to another seat, I'll personally ensure compensation. Miles, vouchers, whatever you need, you'll be taken care of." David closed his eyes for a brief second. The weight of years pressed down every quiet compromise, every time he'd been told to be reasonable, every time he had swallowed his pride for the sake of keeping the peace. But his mother's voice echoed again. "Dignity isn't something you beg for. It's something you stand for." He opened his eyes. "Captain, let me ask you something. If I were wearing a 3-piece suit, would you be offering me miles right now? If my skin were lighter, would we even be having this conversation?" The question pierced the cabin like lightning. Harris froze. Victoria sputtered, "Oh, please." But the weight of David's words had already landed. Sophia leaned forward, her tone crisp. "Captain, you need to be very careful. There are witnesses. There are recordings. This isn't just about a seat anymore. This is about the precedent you set with your decision. Alex Brooks. Phone angled perfectly. Whispered to his live stream. 80,000 viewers. People are calling for accountability. Justice. In the Sky is trending. His chat exploded with comments, "Don't back down." "David, this is bigger than a seat." "Captain, do the right thing." The cabin seemed to pulse with tension. Every eye was fixed on the trio at row 2. Victoria's voice cracked slightly now. "So what, you're just going to let him bully me because he knows how to play the race card? This is absurd." David inhaled slowly, steadying himself. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Mrs. Miller, I don't need to play cards. I have a ticket. That is all I need." The only absurdity here is the refusal to acknowledge it. For a long moment, no one spoke. The hum of the engines was the only sound. Then, softly, almost hesitantly, a woman in row 6 spoke up. "He's right. We all saw his boarding pass. It says 2A. She hasn't shown hers." Another voice followed. A man from row 7. "This isn't about delaying the flight. This is about respect." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the rows. For the first time, the silence broke not against David, but in support of him. Captain Harris looked around, realizing the balance of the cabin had shifted. He saw phones recording, pens moving, eyes glaring. The easy solution had evaporated. David Carter remained steady. His voice was low, almost gentle, but unshakable. "Captain, I am not moving. Not because I enjoy conflict, not because I want compensation, but because for once, this should not end with me stepping aside. Not this time." Harris' shoulders slumped slightly. He looked older, tired, burdened by a choice he didn't want to make. But the truth pressed down from every angle. Victoria's face twisted in disbelief, her certainty unraveling. "You can't be serious. You're going to side with him." Harris didn't answer. Not yet. He turned back toward the cockpit, leaving the cabin buzzing with whispers and questions. David finally sat, not in another row, not in compromise, but firmly in seat 2A. The leather was cool against his back, the space finally his, yet the tension remained, thick in the recycled air. He knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The cabin seemed to breathe with a rhythm of unease. Passengers shifted in their seats, their faces lit by the glow of screens. The hum of the engines was steady, but beneath it, tension hummed louder. David Carter sat back in seat 2A, his posture calm but his mind alert. He could feel the invisible weight of every gaze on him, the unspoken question hanging in the air. What happens now? Across the aisle. Alex Brooks adjusted his phone. The live stream counter climbed higher. 90,000, then 100,000, then more. His chat flooded with messages. "Stay strong. We're with you. This is history in the making." "Folks," Alex whispered into the camera, "you are watching a first-class passenger denied his seat. He's shown proof. The woman refuses. The airline tried to move him instead. And now, the captain hasn't made a clear call. This is what systemic bias looks like in real time." The words traveled faster than the aircraft could ever fly. Within minutes, clips were ripped from the stream and spread across Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. Hashtags multiplied. Justice in the Sky. Seat 2O. Respect in flight. Back in the cabin, Victoria Miller crossed her arms, chin tilted high. Yet her confidence had thinned. She glanced at the recording phones, at the murmuring passengers, at the lawyer scribbling notes nearby. Her voice, when it came, cracked with irritation. "This is an invasion of my privacy. They can't record me." Sofia Ramirez didn't look up from her notes. Public space. Public incident. Witnessing discrimination is not just allowed, it's necessary. Victoria's cheeks burned. She turned her gaze toward David. You're enjoying this, aren't you? Making a spectacle. David shook his head slowly. You think I wanted this. I wanted to sit quietly in my seat and fly home. That's all. The words carried a heaviness that silenced the whispers for a moment. In that pause, the sound of Alex's phone chiming with endless notifications filled the air. From the cockpit, Captain John Harris's voice finally came over the intercom, carefully neutral. Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. We're addressing a seating issue and will update you shortly. The announcement did little to calm anyone, if anything. It underscored the absurdity an entire flight delayed, not because of weather or mechanics, but because one passenger refused to acknowledge another's rightful place. In row 4, the older black woman leaned toward her husband. It's always the same, she whispered. They expect us to step aside. Always. Her husband nodded, his eyes locked on David with quiet pride. David caught their gaze and offered the smallest nod back. It was enough to remind him that this moment wasn't just about him. Meanwhile, on the ground, the ripple effect had turned into a tidal wave. News outlets picked up the trending tags. Push notifications appeared on phones across the country. Passenger dispute seat in alleged racial incident on Skyways Airlines. Screenshots of David's calm face and his hoodie contrasted with Victoria's scowl were plastered side by side on Twitter feeds. Back in the cabin, Alex Brooks looked up from his phone, eyes wide. Sir, he whispered toward David, CNN just picked this up. You're trending worldwide. Victoria's head snapped toward Alex. Trending? Are you kidding me? Her voice rose, brittle and sharp. This is insane. This is not a racial issue. I've been flying this airline for years. I always sit here. He's twisting this into something it's not. Her words faltered under the weight of silence. The passengers weren't convinced. Phones kept recording. Sophia's pen scratched steadily across the page. David leaned forward slightly, his voice still calm. Mrs. Miller, you've had every chance to show your boarding pass, yet you haven't. Why is that? Her lips parted, but no sound came. She reached for her bag, rummaged, then stopped. I don't need to prove anything to you. It was a misstep, and everyone in the cabin knew it. A murmur rose, disbelieving. Wow, someone whispered from row 7. She doesn't even have the pass. Unbelievable, said another voice. Victoria pressed her back against the seat, eyes darting as if searching for an escape. David sat back again, his face unreadable. Inside, though, he felt the familiar pull of exhaustion. He hadn't asked for this, but now, with the world watching, he couldn't back down. Captain Harris returned once more, his face pale. He crouched slightly to speak quietly to David, but his voice carried, Sir, I've been in touch with ground control. Corporate is aware. They're monitoring the live stream. David met his eyes. And what do they say? Captain Harris hesitated. They advise us to resolve this as smoothly as possible. David tilted his head. Smooth for whom? The question stung. Harris straightened, cleared his throat, and turned back toward the cockpit without answering. The silence that followed was broken only by the relentless buzz of Alex's phone. He looked around at the cabin, his camera capturing the moment. We're at 150,000 live viewers. People are demanding accountability. They're calling this a turning point. Victoria groaned, pressing her hands against her temples. This is absurd. This can't be happening. But it was happening. And every second, it grew bigger than any of them could control. David closed his eyes briefly, steadying his breath. He remembered long nights building AeroTech Systems from the ground up, the quiet sacrifices, the whispered doubts he'd endured. He thought of his employees, of his family, of the young men and women who looked like him and who had been told, in countless subtle ways, that they didn't belong. When he opened his eyes, they were clear, steady. He spoke not just to Victoria, not just to the captain, but to everyone listening in the cabin, and, though he didn't fully realize it yet, to millions watching online. "I didn't choose this moment," he said softly, "but I will not shrink from it. Not for comfort, not for convenience, not anymore." The words landed like a stone dropped into still water. Ripples spread through the cabin, through the live stream, through the feeds of people across the globe, and outside, at the gate. Airline executives were already gathering, phones pressed to their ears, voices sharp with panic. Because what began as a single-seat dispute was about to become an international reckoning. The cabin air felt heavy, as though every molecule carried tension. Phones were raised like lanterns in a storm, recording every twitch of expression, every pause, every word. Victoria Miller sat stiff in seat 2A's neighbor, her arms crossed tightly, her cheeks flushed with anger, though a trace of fear had begun to creep into her eyes. Across from her, David Carter remained composed, his calm almost unsettling. Captain John Harris lingered nearby, restless. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, clearly torn between duty and dread. "Mr. Carter," he began, "we need resolution. We can't stay grounded indefinitely." David turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto the captain's. "Resolution, Captain, doesn't come from asking the wrong person to compromise. It comes from accountability." A murmur of agreement drifted through the cabin. Victoria scoffed, forcing a laugh that cracked halfway. "Accountability, please. This man is just making a show. Probably looking for a free upgrade or some lawsuit money. That's how it always goes." The sentence landed like broken glass on a polished floor. A few passengers gasped. Sophia Ramirez's pen froze mid-sentence. The older black woman in row 4 whispered something to her husband that sounded like, "Not again." David's expression didn't change. He leaned back slightly, his hands folded in his lap. Inside, though, a tide rose. He thought of every boardroom where his presence was questioned, every negotiation where he was underestimated, every flight where stares lingered too long. He drew a slow breath. "Mrs. Miller," he said softly, "you believe this is about a free upgrade, that the only reason I stand my ground is because I don't belong here otherwise." She tilted her chin defiantly. "That's exactly what I believe." The words rang through the cabin. The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was suffocating. David reached into his backpack. Passengers leaned forward, curious. From inside, he pulled out his phone, a sleek device, its screen lighting up with a glow sharper than the cabin lights. He tapped a few times, the movements precise, deliberate. Then he held the phone up where everyone could see. The screen displayed an application no ordinary traveler should have access to, a dashboard labeled AeroTech Systems, Flight Operations Control. Real-time data scrolled across it, passenger manifests, engine diagnostics, even ground control communications. Captain Harris froze, his face drained of color. "What is that?" he asked, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. David's tone was measured, but his words carried force. "This, Captain, is the operations interface of the company that powers this airline AeroTech Systems, my company. Gas echoed through the cabin. Alex Brooks nearly dropped his phone. His live stream counter jumped another 10,000 viewers in seconds. David's thumb hovered briefly before pressing a single icon on the screen. A message appeared in bold letters. Owner override initiated. Return to gate immediately. Almost at once, Harris's radio crackled to life. Flight 382. This is ground control. We've received an override order directly from AeroTech Corporate. Confirm you're returning to gate. The captain's eyes snapped to David, then back to his radio. His voice shook. Ground. Confirm, did you say owner override affirmative? Came the reply. Flight grounded. Await instructions. The cabin erupted in stunned whispers. Victoria's face went pale, her bravado crumbling. What? What just happened? How can he? David lowered his phone, his gaze steady on her. You wanted to know what kind of passenger I am. Mrs. Miller. The answer is simple. I'm not just a passenger. I am the CEO of the company that owns the very system keeping this plane in the air. The weight of the words dropped into the room like a stone into water. Shockwaves rippled outward. Sofia Ramirez's pen flew across the page, her lawyer's mind racing. The older couple sat upright, their expressions shifting from pain to awe. Alex Brooks's live stream exploded with comments. He's the CEO, unreal. This is history. Captain Harris stammered. You grounded my flight. With a phone. David nodded once. With a phone, yes. But not for theatrics. For justice. Victoria's lips trembled. She looked around desperately. But every face she saw reflected the truth she had tried to deny her words, her actions. Her entitlement had been exposed under the brightest spotlight imaginable. You can't just do that, she whispered. David's eyes softened, but his voice held firm. Mrs. Miller, I shouldn't have to prove who I am for you to treat me with dignity. That's the tragedy here. Not that I'm a CEO. Not that I can ground a plane, but that you only see worth when it wears a suit, when it carries a title, when it has power. What about the man without these things, the woman who can't fight back? Should their dignity mean less? The cabin was silent again, but this silence was different, thick with emotion, heavy with reflection. Sofia Ramirez finally spoke, her voice cutting through like clear water. Mr. Carter, what you've just done, this isn't just about one flight. This is about exposing something that happens every day, but never with witnesses and never with someone who has the power to stop it. David inclined his head toward her. That's exactly right, Alex whispered to his phone, his audience count passing 200,000. You're watching history. He just grounded a plane to prove a point about dignity. Victoria slumped in her seat, her shoulders collapsing inward. Her confidence had melted away, leaving only the raw edge of regret. I didn't know, she stammered. I didn't know who you were. David's gaze met hers, steady but not cruel. That's the problem. Mrs. Miller, you didn't know who I was, so you decided I was no one. The word struck deeper than any raised voice could have. Outside the cabin, the jet bridge was already filling with airport officials, corporate representatives, and reporters drawn by the viral storm. Inside, the passengers sat in reverent silence, witnesses to a revelation that would soon echo far beyond the walls of this aircraft. For the first time since boarding, David allowed himself to exhale. The moment was far from over. In truth, it was only just beginning. The cabin sat in stunned silence. The hum of the engines was steady, but everything else felt suspended, as though time itself had paused after David Carter's revelation. Phones were still raised, recording, streaming, buzzing with notifications. Faces that had once been skeptical or indifferent now stared at David with something close to awe. Captain John Harris stood frozen in the aisle. His authority, once absolute, had been quietly stripped away in seconds. His eyes darted to the cockpit, then back to David, as if trying to reconcile the man before him with the power he had just witnessed. Victoria Miller sat collapsed in her seat, her arms limp at her sides. Her earlier bravado had drained out of her, leaving behind a pale, trembling figure. She avoided every gaze, especially David's. Sophia Ramirez was the first to break the silence. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice clear and resonant, "I need you to know something. What you've done here won't just vanish when this flight is over. You've created a record, one that will be used in courtrooms, in classrooms, in boardrooms. People are watching, and they will remember." David gave her a small nod. "That's the point, Ms. Ramirez. It's not about me. It's about what happens to everyone else who doesn't have this kind of leverage. From row 4. The older black woman leaned forward, her voice trembling but strong. "Sir, I've been flying for over 50 years. I can't tell you how many times I've been told to move, to compromise, to just let it go, to see you sit there and refuse." Her eyes filled with tears. "You stood for all of us." Her husband placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "It's about time someone did." David's throat tightened. He hadn't expected their words to hit so deeply. For a moment, he thought of his mother again. The lessons she had taught him about dignity and patience. He thought of his father, who used to shake his head after small humiliations and whisper, "One day, son, we won't have to bow our heads anymore." Across the aisle, Alex Brooks whispered into his phone, his eyes wide with adrenaline. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now at 300,000 live viewers. Hashtags are trending worldwide. News anchors are quoting this live stream on air. We are officially in uncharted territory." The cabin buzzed with hushed conversation. A businessman in row 6 shook his head slowly. "I've flown 100 times, but I've never seen anything like this. Never." The young woman across the aisle typed furiously on her phone, live tweeting every moment. "This will change everything," she muttered. David remained silent, letting the voices rise and fall around him. For once, he didn't need to speak. The truth was carrying itself. Then Captain Harris cleared his throat. His voice trembled slightly. "Mr. Carter," he said, I owe you an apology. I should have enforced your right to that seat immediately. Instead, I looked for the easy way out. That was wrong." The words came reluctantly, but they carried sincerity. The passengers shifted again, murmurs of agreement filling the cabin. David studied him for a long moment before replying. "Acknowledgement is the first step, Captain, but what matters most is what happens next." Harris nodded, his shoulders heavy. "Corporate is sending representatives to the gate. They'll want to speak with you." Before David could answer, Victoria suddenly burst out, her voice shrill with desperation. "I said I was sorry I didn't know who he was. Why's everyone acting like I committed some crime?" All eyes turned toward her. Her hands shook as she fumbled with her designer bag, finally pulling out a crumpled boarding pass. She held it up with a defiant shake. "C seat, 4C. It was just a mistake, but the passengers weren't swayed." Sophia raised an eyebrow. A mistake doesn't explain refusing multiple times. A mistake doesn't explain the insults, the assumptions. This wasn't a mistake. It was bias. The older black man in row 4 added softly, "And it's not the first time." Victoria's face twisted, caught between anger and humiliation. "This isn't fair," she whispered. David's voice was calm, almost gentle. "Fairness, Mrs. Miller, is all I asked for, and it should not take my title or my wealth for you or anyone else to recognize that." Her lips trembled. For the first time, tears welled in her eyes. She turned away, pressing her face into her hands. The tension in the cabin eased slightly, replaced by something else: reflection, empathy, even quiet solidarity. Passengers who had been silent before now exchanged glances, nodding slowly, as if acknowledging a truth too long ignored. Alex lowered his phone for a moment, breaking from his stream. "Sir," he said softly to David, "what happens now? Do you press charges? Do you make an example?" David exhaled, staring at the seat back in front of him. He felt the weight of the question. He thought of retribution, of humiliation, of justice. But he also thought of legacy, of what it meant to turn a painful moment into something larger, something transformative. Finally, he spoke. "What happens now isn't about punishment. It's about change. If this moment becomes only about me and Mrs. Miller, then nothing really shifts. But if it sparks a conversation about dignity and bias in every industry, then maybe it was worth the discomfort." The passengers absorbed his words quietly. Outside the plane, the jet bridge was crowded with figure security officers, corporate managers, journalists already holding cameras. The flight wasn't just grounded. It had become a stage for something far larger than anyone on board had anticipated. Inside, David sat in seat 2A, his posture steady, his face composed. He didn't look like a man basking in victory. He looked like a man preparing for the storm yet to come. And deep down, he knew this was no longer about one seat. This was about rewriting the rules of the skies themselves. The jet bridge connected with a dull thud, and the chime overhead rang out. Passengers stirred, gathering their belongings, though no one was in a rush to leave. They knew this wasn't just another delay. They were part of something larger, and they wanted to see how it ended. David Carter remained in seat 2A, his posture calm, his backpack at his feet. His phone rested on his lap, its screen still glowing faintly. He didn't need to check it. He already knew the storm outside was bigger than anything inside the cabin. Through the small gap in the curtain, he caught a glimpse of the jet bridge. Security officers stood shoulder to shoulder. Behind them, men and women in dark suits, their lanyards swinging with every nervous movement. And just beyond, cameras flashed like restless lightning. Captain John Harris's voice came over the intercom, tighter than before. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've returned to the gate. Please remain seated until directed. Representatives from Skyways Airlines will be boarding shortly." A collective murmur rippled through the rows. Passengers glanced at each other, then back at David, as though silently asking if he was ready. He was. The curtain parted. 2 executives entered, followed by a pair of security officers. The first executive, a tall man with silver hair and a navy suit, forced a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Mr. Carter," he began, "I'm Alan Peterson, Vice President of Customer Relations. May we have a word?" David's gaze didn't waver. "You may." Peterson hesitated, glancing at the raised phones, at Sofia Ramirez's watchful eyes, at Alex Brooks's live stream angled perfectly to capture every second. He lowered his voice, though everyone could still hear. Perhaps we can continue this conversation privately. Off the plane. David shook his head slowly. No. Privacy is what allowed things like this to continue for decades. We'll speak here, where the truth started. Murmurs of approval spread through the cabin. The older black man in row 4 whispered, "That's right," his voice carrying just enough to be heard. Peterson's smile faltered. "Very well. On behalf of Skyways Airlines, I want to apologize for the misunderstanding." Sophia's sharp voice cut in immediately. "Misunderstanding? Is that the word you're choosing?" Peterson cleared his throat. "We regret the inconvenience Mr. Carter experienced." David's voice was calm, steady. "You're not apologizing to me, Mr. Peterson. You're apologizing to every passenger who has ever been told to move because someone else assumed they belonged more. Call it what it is, discrimination." The word hung in the air, heavier than steel. Cameras outside the jet bridge flashed brighter, their operators straining to capture audio through the thin barrier. Peterson's polished demeanor cracked for just a second. "Mr. Carter." David leaned forward, his tone unwavering. "This isn't about vouchers. It's not about upgrades. It's about accountability. Your airline asked me, the rightful passenger, to move while protecting someone who refused to show proof. That's not inconvenience. That's bias." The passengers stirred again, some nodding, some murmuring in agreement. Even those who had remained quiet now leaned in, their faces set with conviction. Victoria Miller, still in her seat, let out a bitter laugh. "Oh, please, everyone's overreacting. It was just one seat." Her words landed like poison in the air. Several passengers turned sharply toward her. The young woman from row 6 spoke up, her voice firm. "No, ma'am. It wasn't just a seat. It was the way you treated him, the things you said. That's why we're here." Victoria's mouth opened, but no words came. She sank back into her chair, her shoulders small. Alex Brooks' voice whispered into his mic. "We're at 400,000 live viewers. This is exploding." His phone buzzed constantly with comments. "Don't let them spin this. Stay strong. David, accountability now." Peterson's face grew taut. He turned slightly toward the captain, then back to David. "What do you want, Mr. Carter?" David's answer came without hesitation. "I want acknowledgement. I want your airline to commit, publicly, to reviewing how it handles discrimination not just on this flight, but in every gate, every cabin, every ticket counter. And I want Mrs. Miller removed from this flight." A sharp intake of breath swept the rows. Victoria sat bolt upright, her face flushing. "What you can't do, that I've paid for this ticket." Peterson's voice was low. "Mrs. Miller, please." "No," she snapped, her voice shrill. "He's humiliating me in front of everyone he thinks just because he's—" She stopped herself, but the silence that followed finished the sentence for her. David's eyes softened, though his tone stayed firm. "Mrs. Miller, this is not about humiliation. It's about consequence. The same consequence that people of color endure every time they are told to move, to wait, to be silent." The older black woman in row 4 wiped her eyes. "Bless you," she whispered. Peterson sighed, the weight of the moment pressing into his shoulders. He exchanged a look with the other executive, then nodded slowly. "Very well, Mrs. Miller. You will be rebooked on another flight. Security will escort you from the aircraft." Victoria's face crumpled. She opened her mouth to protest again, but the words faltered when she saw the eyes around her eyes that no longer looked away, eyes that no longer excused. Security stepped closer. Her defiance melted into silence. As she rose from the seat, clutching her bag, the cabin remained quiet. Not mocking, not jeering, just quiet. The kind of silence that marks a reckoning. David watched her go, his expression unreadable. Inside, though, he felt a mix of emotions, sadness, relief, and a weary sense of justice long delayed. When the door closed behind her, Peterson turned back to David. "We'll comply with your request for a public statement. Corporate will issue it before the day is over." David nodded. "Then maybe this flight can finally move forward." The passengers exhaled almost in unison, as though releasing hours of held breath. Phones lowered, shoulders eased. The tension that had bound them all began to loosen, replaced by something else. Respect. Alex Brooks whispered to his audience one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've just witnessed it. Accountability in real time. This is bigger than one flight. It's a message." David leaned back into seat 2A, his gaze turning toward the small oval window. Outside, the tarmac lights glowed faintly in the dusk. He thought of his mother's voice again, the lessons she'd pressed into him. He thought of the countless faces who had never gotten this chance. For them, he promised silently, he would not waste this moment. The door sealed shut with a heavy click. Victoria Miller was gone. For the first time since boarding, the cabin felt lighter. Still tense, still buzzing, but lighter, like the moment after a storm breaks, when the air is heavy with rain, but the thunder has rolled on. David Carter sat back in seat 2A, his hands resting on his knees. Around him, passengers shifted in their seats, some leaning closer, some whispering, all acutely aware that they were part of something far larger than a delayed flight. Captain John Harris returned to the cockpit without a word. Moments later, his voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. We will now be preparing for departure." A ripple of relief moved through the rows. The engines roared, the plane lurched forward, and finally, after hours of tension, Flight 382 began to taxi once again. But the silence wasn't empty, it was charged. People weren't simply relieved to be moving. They were reflecting, recalibrating, reevaluating the meaning of what they had just witnessed. From across the aisle, Sophia Ramirez leaned toward David. Her voice was soft but certain. "You realize what you've set in motion, don't you?" David turned his head slightly. "I realize it's bigger than me. That's all I need to know." Sophia studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You stood your ground, not with anger, not with shouting, but with quiet resolve. That will resonate louder than any headline." Behind them, Alex Brooks adjusted his phone again, though the live stream had ended when the plane disconnected from the gate's Wi-Fi. His notifications still poured in, vibrating his device nonstop. He looked over at David, his tone almost reverent. 500,000 people were watching by the end. By the time we land, it'll be millions. You're everywhere. Mr. Carter. David offered a faint smile. "That wasn't the goal." Alex shook his head. "Maybe not, but sometimes the story chooses you." The older black couple in row 4 leaned forward, their voices quiet but filled with emotion. The woman said, "Young man, I just want to thank you. You don't know how many years we've carried this weight. To see you refuse to move, to see you hold your place, it felt like all of us were sitting in 2A with you." Her husband added, "We've seen progress. Sure, but we've also seen how easy it is for the world to expect us to stay quiet. You reminded us we don't have to." David felt his chest tighten. He bowed his head slightly in gratitude. "Thank you. That means more than you know." The engines roared louder as the plane lifted off the ground, climbing into the sky. Lights twinkled below, Atlanta shrinking into a glittering map. Yet inside the cabin, the real illumination came not from the city, but from the shift in spirit among the passengers. People began talking across aisles, sharing their thoughts openly. A businessman admitted, "I'll be honest, I probably would have stayed quiet if this hadn't gone public. But watching you handle it with such composure, it made me realize how often silence is part of the problem." A young woman added, "I've scrolled past stories like this before, thinking, what can I do? But seeing it happen right here, right in front of me, it's different. I can't ignore it anymore." Sophia turned in her seat, addressing the small circle of passengers around her. Moments like this don't just belong to history books. They belong to us. Each of us gets to decide what we'll do with what we've witnessed. The words settled over them, pulling everyone deeper into thought. David stared out the window. Clouds rolled by, illuminated by the glow of the setting sun. For a brief moment, he allowed himself a quiet exhale. He hadn't wanted to be the center of a storm. Yet now, with the sky stretched wide before him, he knew the storm had a purpose. Hours later, somewhere over the Midwest, phones buzzed back to life as the aircraft's Wi-Fi connection returned. Notifications poured in like a flood. Headlines lit up screens. Skyways passenger confronts. Racism in first class. Black CEO grounds plane in fight for dignity. The seat to A movement goes global. David's own name filled the news feeds. Photos of him in his hoodie, calm and steady, circulated with captions like, "This is what dignity looks like." Alex Brooks gasped as he scrolled. "Sir, you've got to see this. Hashtag #OurSeat2 isn't just trending, it's the #1 topic worldwide. Celebrities are tweeting about it. Civil rights groups are calling for investigations. Even government officials are weighing in." Sophia looked over, her lawyer's instincts sparking. This could reshape policy. "Mr. Carter, airlines will have to respond. They can't pretend this didn't happen." David leaned back, the enormity settling on his shoulders. He hadn't asked for any of this. Yet maybe, just maybe, this was the reason he had been put in that seat on this day, on this flight. As the plane soared westward, passengers began to treat him differently, not with fawning admiration, but with respect, genuine, quiet respect. Some simply nodded as they passed him on the way to the restroom. Others offered small smiles, gestures that spoke volumes. For the first time all day, David felt the burden ease, but he knew the hardest part was still to come. When the plane landed, when the cameras flashed, when the microphones crowded toward him, then he would need to decide what to do with the firestorm he had sparked. The intercom crackled again. Captain Harris's voice, quieter now, carried through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're cruising at 37,000 feet. Estimated arrival in San Francisco in 3 hours. Thank you for your patience today." The words seemed almost too simple for the day they had lived through, but maybe simplicity was the point. At 37,000 feet, in a world suspended between earth and sky, the truth had finally broken free, and far below, on the ground, the world was waiting. The wheels hit the tarmac with a jolt that rippled through the cabin. Passengers instinctively tightened their seatbelts, the familiar shudder of arrival pulling them back into the gravity of the moment. But this landing was different. Everyone knew it. David Carter sat still, his hands folded loosely, his gaze fixed on the seat in front of him. For 3 hours, he had tried to prepare himself for what waited outside. He had rehearsed in his mind, discarded lines, and reshape them again, knowing full well that nothing could truly prepare him for the storm. The intercom crackled. Captain John Harris's voice was calm but tight. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to San Francisco. Local time is 8:42 p.m. For those of you continuing onward, please check the monitors inside the terminal. For everyone disembarking here, thank you for your patience today." The words seemed painfully ordinary after a day that was anything but. The plane rolled to a stop. Seatbelt signs dinged off, but no one rushed to stand. Passengers hesitated, glancing at David, glancing at each other, as if unsure of the etiquette for leaving a flight that had already become history. Finally, a flight attendant, Emily Parker, stepped into the aisle. Her face was pale, her smile forced. She cleared her throat. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated for just a few moments. There are some security procedures we need to follow before disembarking." Murmurs rippled through the cabin. Everyone understood what that meant. Through the small oval windows, flashes of light broke the night. Camera crews, news reporters, security personnel. The jet bridge was crowded, not with ordinary staff, but with executives in dark suits, faces tense under the glow of phones and floodlights. David closed his eyes briefly. He inhaled, exhaled, then reached down to pick up his bag. His fingers brushed against the worn leather strap, a reminder of his father, who had carried the same bag to work decades earlier, a man who had taught him to move through the world with dignity, even when the world refused to see it. The aisle stirred as passengers began to rise, but instead of rushing forward, they moved deliberately, one by one, pausing to glance at David. Some whispered encouragement. Others simply touched his shoulder lightly as they passed. The older black couple from row 4 stopped at his seat. The man looked down at David, eyes moist with unspoken gratitude. "Son," he said, his voice breaking, "you made us proud today." David's throat tightened. He nodded. "Thank you." The woman leaned close, her hand briefly covering his. "Don't let them turn this into noise. Make it matter." He met her gaze. "That's the plan." Sophia Ramirez waited until most passengers had gone before standing. "Are you ready?" she asked. "No," David admitted, his voice low. "But I'll go anyway." Sophia gave a small smile. That's what courage is. When David finally stepped into the aisle, Alex Brooks was waiting just behind him. His phone was clutched tightly, still buzzing nonstop. "Mr. Carter, the feed is live again. They're all waiting for you." David looked at the young man, then at the glowing screen. Thousands of comments scrolled upward in real time. People from every corner of the world were tuned in. He felt the weight of it, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. The jet bridge door opened. The noise hit instantly. Shouts from reporters, the rapid-fire clicks of cameras, security calls. It was a wall of sound, overwhelming and immediate. David stepped forward, the first few feet bathed in white light from dozens of lenses. Questions flew like arrows. "Carter, how do you respond to accusations of discrimination on Skyways Airlines? Is it true? You grounded the flight personally. What do you say to passengers who claim this incident reflects systemic racism in air travel? Do you plan to take legal action against Ms. Miller? Are you going to resign as CEO of AeroTech?" David lifted a hand, not sharply, but firmly enough that the crowd quieted. His voice, when it came, was steady. "I'll answer your questions, but I need you to hear me first." The camera zoomed closer. Every microphone stretched forward. "This isn't about one woman and one seat," David said. "This isn't even about one airline. This is about the pattern, decades of it, where dignity is negotiable depending on who you are and how you look. He paused, letting the words settle. Today, I refused to move. Not because I needed the seat, but because I needed the truth to be visible. Because too often, people like me are asked to compromise, to stay quiet, to give way for someone else's comfort. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras clicked. David continued, "I'm not here to shame individuals. I'm here to challenge a system. And I promise you, this AeroTech will not stand on the sidelines. We are going to lead change, real, measurable change, to ensure that what happened on Flight 382 never happens again." The crowd erupted. Reporters shouted follow-up questions. Passengers who had been on the flight stood nearby, nodding in agreement. Some even clapped quietly, as if afraid to break the gravity of the moment. Sophia stepped closer, whispering just loud enough for him to hear. That was the right tone. Strong, but not bitter. It'll resonate. Alex turned his phone toward David. The live stream comments poured in. Finally, someone said it. This is history. Go. Seat 2A forever. As security escorted him toward a private lounge, David glanced back. Through the chaos, he caught sight of Emily Parker, the flight attendant. She stood near the exit, her posture tense, her eyes conflicted. Their gazes met briefly. She looked away, shame flickering across her face. David didn't linger. He knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Inside the lounge, the noise dulled. Executive representatives from Skyways waited in a semicircle, their smiles brittle, their eyes calculating. One man in a Navy suit extended his hand. "Mr. Carter, we'd like to discuss the situation privately." David shook his head. "We'll discuss it, but not privately. Not behind closed doors. This belongs in the open." The executive stiffened. One muttered something about liability. Another whispered about shareholder confidence. David set his bag down on the table. His voice was calm but firm. "You can either choose transparency now or have it forced upon you later. Either way, the world is watching." Silence. Then, reluctantly, they nodded. David leaned back, exhaling slowly. He knew what was coming. Meetings, interviews, endless debates. But he also knew something deeper. A shift had begun. Not just in the airline industry, not just in corporate boardrooms, but in the hearts of people who had watched him sit in 2A and refuse to be moved. And for the first time that day, he felt something unexpected rise within him. Hope. The press conference stretched late into the night. By the time David Carter finally left the airport, the crowd had thinned, but the cameras never stopped rolling. His words replayed on every network, clipped into sound bites, looped across timelines. By sunrise, his face calm, resolute, dressed in nothing more than a hoodie, and jeans had become a symbol. Yet for David, the true weight of the moment didn't hit until he closed the door of his San Francisco apartment hours later. He dropped his bag by the couch and stood in the silence. For the first time all day, he was alone, alone with the echoes, alone with the memory of Victoria Miller's disdainful laugh, alone with the looks of doubt from Emily Parker, alone with the gratitude in the eyes of the older couple, alone with Sophia's steady presence, Alex's relentless camera, and the roar of a world that had suddenly decided to listen. He sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. The adrenaline that had carried him for hours began to fade, replaced by the raw exhaustion of a man who had not asked to be a symbol but could no longer escape the role. A buzzing phone broke the silence. Jordan Matthews, His chief of staff at AeroTech had sent a single message. "We need to talk strategy. The world is waiting." David stared at the words. Then he typed back, "Tomorrow. Tonight. I just need to breathe. For a few precious hours." He allowed himself rest. The next day began the whirlwind. At AeroTech's headquarters, reporters lined the sidewalks. Inside, staff worked tirelessly to field calls from government agencies, civil rights organizations, and airline executives. Investors, far from panicking, expressed cautious optimism. AeroTech stock had surged overnight, proof that integrity could hold value in the market as well as in the heart. In the boardroom, Jordan clicked through slides filled with headlines and data. "This isn't a story anymore, David. It's a movement. Seat 2A has become shorthand for dignity. We can either step back or step forward." David looked around the table at his team: brilliant engineers, seasoned executives, young analysts with eyes wide open. They weren't just waiting for orders. They were waiting for direction. He spoke slowly, carefully. "We're stepping forward, but not with press releases, with systems, with accountability, with change that sticks." The room came alive. Ideas poured forth: bias detection algorithms, real-time complaint reporting, transparency dashboards accessible to passengers and regulators alike. AeroTech already powered the backbone of Skyway's systems. With a few decisive moves, they could power fairness itself. Sophia Ramirez joined via video call. Her voice was sharp, legal mind in overdrive. "We need more than tech. We need policy, documentation, enforcement. If we marry technology with civil rights frameworks, we can create something the industry can't ignore." David nodded. "Then that's what we'll build." Weeks turned into months. The momentum didn't fade. If anything, it grew. Other airlines faced public scrutiny. Passengers shared their own stories, flooding social media with tales of discrimination long hidden. Lawmakers called for hearings. Civil rights groups pushed for reform. Through it all, David remained steady. He gave interviews not dramatic, not self-centered, but clear and unflinching. He spoke at universities, reminding students that progress required vigilance. He met with union leaders, acknowledging that employees also needed protection from bias. One evening, nearly 3 months after Flight 382, David returned to Atlanta for a speaking engagement. The venue was packed: students, activists, business leaders, ordinary travelers. On stage, he stood behind a simple podium, nothing flashy. He began softly. 3 months ago, I was just a man trying to take his seat. That's all. I wasn't trying to make history. I wasn't trying to start a movement. I just wanted fairness." He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. But fairness, it turns out, is not simple. Fairness has to be built, protected, defended, again and again. His voice grew stronger. "Oh, Seat 2O isn't about me. It's about anyone who's ever been told, directly or indirectly, that they don't belong. It's about refusing to give up your place. And it's about building systems so that no one has to fight that battle alone ever again." The applause was thunderous. People rose to their feet. Some wept. Others simply stood in silence, hands pressed to their hearts. Afterward, as David walked backstage, he saw a familiar face waiting: Emily Parker, the flight attendant. Her posture was different now, less rigid, more vulnerable. "Mr. Carter," she said softly, "I came to apologize." David studied her, saying nothing at first. Emily's voice trembled. "I made assumptions. I thought I was keeping the peace. But really, I was protecting comfort at the expense of fairness. I see that now. And I'm sorry." David exhaled. He could hear the sincerity. He could also hear the struggle of someone who was still learning. "You are part of the system," he said gently. "Now you get to be part of changing it." Emily's eyes filled with tears. "I want that." Months later, she would become one of AeroTech's leading trainers, teaching airline staff how to recognize bias and respond with justice. Change, David realized, didn't always start with the strongest. Sometimes it started with those willing to admit they had been wrong. 3 years passed. AeroTech's equity protocols became the gold standard across the industry. Complaints of discrimination plummeted. Passengers of color reported dramatically improved experiences. Transparency reports were published quarterly, open to all. David stood once again in a first-class cabin, but this time not as a passenger. He was leading a demonstration of new bias prevention technology for airline executives from around the world. Screens displayed real-time monitoring of staff interactions, anonymous passenger feedback, and automated escalation processes. "This," David said, "is not about punishment. It's about accountability. It's about building a culture where fairness is the norm, not the exception." After the demonstration, he sat quietly in seat 2A, the same seat that had once been contested, now empty except for him. Outside the window, clouds drifted by. Sophia sat beside him, her tone lighter than he had ever heard it. From one seat to the world. Who would have thought David smiled? It was never about the seat. It was about the principle. The seat was just the spark. Sophia tilted her head, and the fire David looked out at the sky. The fire belongs to everyone who refuses to be moved. He closed his eyes briefly, hearing again the words of the older woman. From row 4, "Don't let them turn this into noise. Make it matter." He had, and the world was different because of it. The story of David Carter is not just about a seat on an airplane. It's about the weight of dignity in everyday life. Many of us, especially those who have lived long enough, know the sting of being overlooked, dismissed, or treated as though our worth is negotiable. It reminds us that injustice often begins not with grand events, but with small choices moments where people assume, judge, or look away. What David teaches us is that standing firm doesn't always require anger or force. Sometimes, the most powerful act is calm resistance. By refusing to be moved, he reminded the world that respect is not earned by titles or wealth. It is owed to every human being simply because they exist. For those of us who have carried years of silent battles, this story is an invitation to reflect how many times have we given up our seat so someone else could be comfortable, and how can we, in whatever years we have ahead, leave a legacy of courage, fairness, and hope. The lesson is simple, but profound. Dignity is not optional. And when one person stands, they open the door for countless others to do the same. Thank you for taking the time to watch and share in this journey with us. Stories like this matter because they reflect the struggles and the strength within all of us. If this touched your heart, please like the video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel. Together, we can keep these conversations alive and build a world where dignity and respect are never negotiable.